Humans did not invent alcohol. A single amino acid mutation about 10 million years ago let our ape ancestors metabolize the rotting fruit on the forest floor instead of dying of poisoning, and by the time we built the pyramids, we were paying our workers in beer. This is the story of how a chemical accident in some fallen mangoes ended up running every civilization on the planet. The drunken monkey. In 2014, a team of biochemists, led by Matthew Kerrigan and Stephen Benner, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that reconstructed an enzyme our ape ancestors had been using to digest fruit roughly 10 million years ago. The enzyme is called alcohol dehydrogenase class 4, or ADH4, and it sits in the lining of your tongue, esophagus, and stomach. Its job is to start breaking down ethanol before it ever reaches your bloodstream. What Kerrigan and Benner found was that around 10 million years ago, in the common ancestor of humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas, a single amino acid in this enzyme changed. The change is technically called the A294V substitution. The result was that this enzyme suddenly became roughly 40 times better at metabolizing alcohol than it had been before. This is not a small mutation. The reason it happened is geographic. Around 10 million years ago, the ancestors of the great apes were transitioning from a fully arboreal life in the canopy down to spending more time on the forest floor. The fruit you find on the floor is fundamentally different from the fruit you find on the branch. It is overripe, it has been sitting there, and in tropical conditions it ferments, sometimes aggressively, sometimes reaching alcohol concentrations of several percent. An ape eating a stomach full of windfall fruit without ADH4 would be poisoned, possibly fatally. An ape with the A294V mutation could eat the fallen fruit, extract the calories, and walk away. This is not just a story. In 2022, the primatologist Christina Campbell published a study in Royal Society Open Science showing that wild spider monkeys in Panama routinely eat fruit at 1 to 2% alcohol by volume, and her team detected the metabolic byproducts of ethanol in their urine. Pen-tailed tree shrews in Malaysia drink fermented palm nectar at up to 3.8% alcohol every night, and show no behavioral signs of being drunk. Cedar waxwings in California occasionally gorge on fermented hawthorn berries and die of acute intoxication. The biologist Robert Dudley, who wrote a book called The Drunken Monkey in 2014, summarized the situation this way: where there is sugar in the tropics, there is alcohol. The fascination humans have with getting drunk is not a cultural quirk. It is a 10 million-year-old metabolic relationship. A cave in Israel, 13,000 B.C. In 2018, a team of researchers led by the Stanford archaeologist Li Lu published a paper in the Journal of Archaeological Science Reports announcing what is currently the oldest evidence of intentional alcohol production by humans anywhere in the world. The location was Rakafet Cave, a Natufian burial site on the southwestern slope of Mount Carmel in northern Israel. The age was approximately 13,000 B.C. This predates the earliest known cereal agriculture in the Levant by roughly 3,000 years. The Natufians were a late Pleistocene people who lived in the eastern Mediterranean from about 13,000 to 10,000 BC. They were semi-sedentary. They built houses out of stone. They buried their dead in caves with grave goods and elaborate ritual. They were not yet farmers. They were on the edge of being farmers, but they had not yet domesticated wheat or barley. What Lu's team analyzed were 3 stone mortars carved into the bedrock floor of Rakefet Cave. The deep mortars are 40 to 60 centimeters deep. The team examined microscopic residue from inside these mortars and found starch granules and phytoliths consistent with malted wheat and malted barley, plus traces of oats and legumes, and evidence of plant fiber consistent with bast fiber sacs lining the mortars during fermentation. The technique implied is the same one any modern brewer would recognize. Wild cereal grains were soaked to germinate, then dried to halt germination, then mashed and heated, then fermented in the cave. The Stanford team replicated the process and produced a low-alcohol, soup-like ancient beer. The crucial detail is the location of the mortars. They are inside a Natufian graveyard. The beer was being brewed for funeral rituals. The oldest documented intentional alcohol in the world was made to be drunk in the presence of the dead. As Li Lu put it on the record, this accounts for the oldest record of man-made alcohol in the world, perhaps to honor their dead. The jars at Jiahu. The oldest chemically confirmed alcoholic beverage was found at a Neolithic village in central China called Jiahu, in modern Henan province. The site was occupied from roughly 7,000 to 6,600 BC, about 5,000 years before the pyramids. Jiahu is already famous in archaeology for 2 other reasons. It is the fine spot for the Jiahu flutes, which are the oldest playable musical instruments in human history, made of red-crowned crane wing bones. It is also where archaeologists found tortoise shells with proto-writing marks on them, suggesting symbolic notation predating Chinese writing by several thousand years. People at Jiahu were making music, possibly the earliest written symbols, and as it turns out, fermenting things. In 2004, Patrick McGovern of the University of Pennsylvania Museum, who is the world's leading molecular archaeologist of alcohol, published a paper in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzing the residue from 16 pottery jars at Jiahu. The chemical signature came back as a mixed fermented beverage. The biomarkers were tartaric acid, which comes from grape or hawthorn fruit, beeswax compounds from honey, and phytosterol ferulate esters from rice. The drink was a blend of rice, honey, and fruit, fermented together in a single jar. McGovern called it a Neolithic grog. Then he did something genuinely modern with this 9,000-year-old chemistry. In 2006, McGovern collaborated with the American craft brewer Sam Calagione of Dogfish Head Brewery and released a beer based on the Jiahu residue. They called it Chateau Jiahu. It is made with brown rice syrup, orange blossom honey, muscat grapes, and hawthorn fruit. It periodically goes back into production. You can occasionally buy a bottle of the world's oldest documented alcohol at a liquor store. Maybe beer-built civilization. In 1953, an archaeologist named Robert Braidwood, who had been excavating an early Neolithic site in northern Iraq, was sitting at the American Anthropologists Symposium on the Origins of Agriculture when a botanist named Jonathan Sauer asked him a question that has never been fully answered. The question was this: what if the reason humans started cultivating grain was not to make bread but to make beer? Braidwood put it for the record in his own words, asking whether the discovery that a mash of fermented grain yielded a palatable and nutritious beverage could have acted as a greater stimulant toward the experimental selection and breeding of cereals than the discovery of flour and bread making. The question went into the proceedings, got laughed at by some of the room, and refused to die. This is not a punchline. Some of the most respected archaeologists of the second half of the 20th century took it seriously. In 1986, Solomon Katz of the University of Pennsylvania and Mary Voigt published a paper in the magazine Expedition called Bread and Beer. They argued that fermented grain is significantly more nutritious than unleavened bread. Fermentation liberates B vitamins. It pre-digests anti-nutrients. The end product is shelf-stable, social, psychoactive, and more nutritious per labor hour than bread. From the standpoint of an early Neolithic farmer deciding whether the painful process of grain cultivation was worth it, the math works much better if the end goal was a buzz. The site that gives this hypothesis its strongest support is Göbekli Tepe, the massive carved stone ritual complex in southeastern Turkey that Klaus Schmidt excavated from 1995 until his death in 2014. Göbekli Tepe is older than agriculture. It dates to roughly 9000 BC. It has T-shaped limestone pillars weighing up to 20 tons each, decorated with carved animals. It is sometimes called the world's first temple. Inside it are large stone basins, some holding 160 liters, which a 2012 paper by Oliver Dietrich and Klaus Schmidt argued contained calcium oxalate residue. Calcium oxalate is what brewers call beer stone. It is the mineral deposit left by mashing and fermenting grain in a vessel. The implication is that humans may have built the world's first temple, gathered there in ritual groups, and brewed beer for the assembly before any of them had figured out how to grow wheat in a field. Not all archaeologists buy this. The honest answer is that the evidence is consistent with brewing, not conclusive. But the hypothesis has refused to die for 70 years. The goddess who filled the mouth. By the time of the Sumerian civilization, around 4,000 years ago, alcohol had stopped being a curiosity and had become an institution. The Sumerians had a goddess of brewing. Her name was Ninkasi, which roughly translates as the lady who fills the mouth. She was the daughter of Enki, the god of wisdom and creation, and her job in the Sumerian pantheon was to oversee the production of beer. Around 1800 BC, somebody composed a song called the Hymn to Ninkasi. It survives on clay tablets in cuneiform. It is two things at once. It is a religious prayer to the goddess. It is also, in a kind of poetic shorthand, a step-by-step beer recipe. It describes shaping a starter dough called bapir, baking it twice into hard biscuits, soaking the malted grain in a jar, spreading the cooked mash on reed mats, and pouring the filtered beer out of a collector vat in language that compares the rush of the beer to the rush of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. In 1989, the brewmaster Fritz Maytag of Anchor Brewing in San Francisco collaborated with the Sumerologist Miguel Civil, whose 1964 translation of the hymn is still the standard, and brewed a batch using the hymn as a guide. The result was a low-alcohol, cider-dry beverage of around 3.5%. They drank it through long reed straws from a shared vessel, which is how the Sumerians had done it, because the unfiltered mash floats on top and the cleaner liquid sits underneath. Beer was the central currency of Sumerian wage labor. A surviving clay tablet from around 2050 BC, currently held at Trinity College in Dublin, records that a man named Amma acknowledged receiving from his brewer a Lulu 5 Sila, or roughly 4.5 liters, of best-grade beer. This is the oldest beer receipt in human history. The Code of Hammurabi from around 1750 B. C included entire sections regulating alehouses. The penalty for a tavern keeper caught defrauding a customer on the price of beer was to be drowned. A priestess caught drinking in a tavern was to be burned alive. The Babylonians took their beer seriously. They paid the pyramid builders in beer. The Egyptians ran their state on beer. At the pre-dynastic Egyptian site of Hierakonpolis in Upper Egypt, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of a brewery operating around 3500 BC, with 12 large vats, each capable of producing several hundred liters per cycle. This is, at present, the oldest industrial-scale brewery anywhere in the world. By the time the Great Pyramid of Giza was being built, around 2500 BC, the system was fully institutional. In the late 20th and early 21st century, Mark Lehner and Zahi Hawass excavated a site southeast of Giza called Hayt el Ghurab, which is the workers' village that housed the men who actually built the pyramids. The standard daily ration for a pyramid worker was bread, onions, and beer. The popular figure of 4 to 5 liters per worker per day is an extrapolation from jar capacities and head counts rather than a documented number, but the qualitative point is solid. The pyramid workers were paid, in part, in beer. Egyptian beer, in 2500 B.C. was thick, around 3 to 4% alcohol, more like liquid porridge than modern lager. The religious mythology of beer in Egypt is even better. The god Ra, in a New Kingdom myth called the Book of the Heavenly Cow, decides at one point that humans have been misbehaving too long and must be destroyed. He sends his daughter Hathor in the form of the lion-headed warrior goddess Sekhmet to slaughter humanity. Sekhmet enthusiastically does so. Ra changes his mind. He needs to stop her. He orders 7,000 jugs of beer dyed red with ochre poured out over the fields of Dendera. Sekhmet, mistaking the red beer for blood, drinks all of it. She passes out. She wakes up as the gentle goddess Hathor. Humanity is saved by beer. This was not a one-off story. The Egyptians celebrated it. The Festival of Drunkenness was an annual public event held at the Temple of Mut in Karnak. The Egyptologist Betsy Bryan of Johns Hopkins University excavated a structure called the Porch of Drunkenness in the Mut precinct in the 2000s. It was built by the pharaoh Hatshepsut around 1470 B.C., and its inscriptions explicitly describe ritual intoxication as a form of religious devotion. The Egyptians built a porch for the express purpose of getting drunk to please a goddess. The cradle of wine was a cave in Armenia. The oldest chemical evidence of wine anywhere in the world was found in 2017 in pottery sherds from 2 Neolithic villages south of Tbilisi in the country of Georgia. The villages are called Gadakrili Gora and Shulaveris Gora. The sherds date to around 6000 B.C. Patrick McGovern, the same molecular archaeologist who analyzed the Jiahu jars, led the analysis. The biomarker was tartaric acid combined with malic, succinic, and citric acids in proportions that match grape juice. The paper, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, concluded that this is the oldest example of the domestication of Eurasian grape solely for wine production. Wine, as a cultural technology, originated in the South Caucasus around 8,000 years ago. The earlier title holder, until 2017, was a site called Haji Firuz Tepe in northwestern Iran, where McGovern had found wine residue in jars dating to about 5400 BC. The Haji Firuz wine had been made with terebinth tree resin added as a preservative, which is the same trick the modern Greeks used to make retsina. But the most spectacular wine site is in Armenia. In 2007, a team of Armenian, American, and Irish archaeologists, led by Boris Gasparian, Gregory Areshian, and Ron Pinhasi found, inside Areni 1 cave in the mountains of Veytsjor province, a fully intact wine production facility from around 4100 BC. There is a 1-meter diameter shallow clay basin where grapes were stomped. There is a fermentation vat 60 centimeters deep that the basin drained into. There are storage jars. There are ceramic drinking cups. There are desiccated grape pips, vine stems, and grape skins. The residue inside the vessels tested positive for malvidin, the pigment that gives red wine its color. This is, by every measure, the oldest known complete winery in the world. The facility is, like Rakafet, located inside a burial cave. The graves contain mostly children. The wine, like the beer at Rakefet, was made for funerals. The earliest people to make wine in any serious quantity made it for the dead. The same cave contains, in a side chamber, what is currently the oldest complete leather shoe in the world, dated to around 3500 BC. Veytsjor province is the find spot of both the world's oldest known winery and the world's oldest known footwear. The Greeks watered it down 3-1. By the time wine reached the Greeks, in the 2nd millennium BC, it had become the social organizing principle of educated male life. The Greek institution of the symposium, which literally means drinking together, was conducted with a strict protocol. Wine was always cut with water before serving. The standard ratios documented in Athenian sources were 3 parts water to 1 part wine for a long, contemplative evening of philosophical conversation, 2 parts water for a livelier feast, and 1 to 1 for a clearly excessive night that the host would later regret. Drinking wine straight, the Greeks said, was the practice of barbarians, specifically of the Scythians and the Thracians. Plato in his Laws explicitly attributes the practice of drinking unmixed wine to the Scythians and Thracians, and says they pour it on their clothes for emphasis. The central object of the symposium was a large mixing bowl called a crater. The host or master of the evening, called the symposiarch, decided the ratio. Specialized cups, jugs, and cooling vessels supported the crater. Attic vase painters competed to decorate them. Some of the most beautiful surviving objects from ancient Greece are wine cups. The mythology supporting this was elaborate. Dionysus, the god of wine, was also the god of theater, ritual madness, and the dissolution of social boundaries. His followers, the Maenads, were said to tear cattle apart with their bare hands in ecstatic frenzy. The annual Athenian festival of the Anthesteria opened the New Year's wine in a 3-day public ritual that included a drinking contest called the Day of the Pitchers, in which even 3-year-old children were given their first sip in a tiny pitcher. The Romans inherited Greek wine culture and did the same thing on a larger and louder scale. In 186 BC, the Roman Senate passed a famous decree restricting the secret cult of Bacchus, which they believed had grown into a conspiracy involving 7,000 people. The historian Livy describes the Bacchanalia scandal in Book 39 of his history in lurid detail, involving ritual murder, forged wills, and orgies in the catacombs. Modern historians read Livy's account as wild exaggeration, but the underlying anxiety is real. Pliny the Elder, in Book 14 of his Natural History, catalogued 195 named wines, and used the phrase that truth has commonly been ascribed to wine, which is the source of the proverb in vino veritas. Alcohol is the Arabic word for eyeliner. The transition from fermented to distilled alcohol, from beer and wine to spirits, happened in the medieval Islamic world. The underlying technique of distillation predates Islam. A Greek-Egyptian alchemist named Maria, sometimes called Maria the Jewess, working in Alexandria around 300 AD, invented a 3-spouted apparatus called the tribikos that she used to purify metals and produce essential oils. She also gave her name to the bain-marie. Primitive distillation existed in China and India, but the apparatus and the systematic chemistry of distillation were refined in the workshops of the Islamic Golden Age, primarily by 2 men. The first was Jabir ibn Hayyan, who lived around 721 to 815 AD, and is the figure to whom the Jabirian corpus of alchemical texts is attributed. Jabir codified the practical Arabic distillation apparatus called the alembic, from the Arabic word al-anbiq, which came from the Greek ambics. The second was Abu Bakr Muhammad ibn Zakaria al-Razi, who lived from around 854 to 925 AD and worked in Rayy and Baghdad. He wrote a manual called the Kitab al-Asrar, the Book of Secrets, which described practical distillation in detail. Al-Razi was the first person we know of to isolate and chemically describe ethanol as a distinct substance separated from fermented liquid. He did this for medicinal and chemical purposes. Whether he drank any of it himself is debated. The word alcohol comes from a different Arabic source. The original Arabic word al-kul referred to a fine antimony powder used as eyeliner, the substance modern English calls kohl. Arab alchemists adopted al-kul as a general term for any finely refined essence produced by distillation. In 16th century European chemistry, the phrase alcohol vini meant the essence of wine. By the 18th century, the word had narrowed to mean ethanol specifically. The English word for the substance in your glass is the Arabic word for eyeshadow. The technique migrated into Christian Europe through the medical school at Salerno in southern Italy and through Spain. The Catalan physician Arnaldus de Villanova, working at Montpellier in the late 13th century, treated distilled wine as a medicine and called it aqua vitae, the water of life. The phrase migrated north. In Gallic it became wish betha, water of life, which is the source of the modern word whiskey. In Polish and Russian, it became woda, little water, which is the source of vodka. In Spanish, it became aguardiente, burning water. The first reliable documentary mention of Scottish whiskey is a 1494 entry in the Exchequer Rolls, recording 8 bowls of malt issued to a friar named John Core to make aqua vitae. The 400 Drunken Rabbits. While Islamic alchemists were perfecting distillation in Baghdad and Salerno, the Aztecs in central Mexico had been making and worshipping their own alcoholic drink for centuries. The drink was pulque, the fermented sap of the maguey, or agave, plant. The alcohol level is around 4 to 8%. The technique was straightforward. Tap a mature agave for its sap, called aguamiel, and leave it to ferment in the open air with naturally occurring yeast. Within days you have a milky, faintly viscous, slightly tart drink. The Aztec religious treatment of pulque is the most elaborate alcoholic mythology in human history. The goddess of the agave plant was Mayawel, depicted as a woman with 400 breasts, all of them lactating. Her partner was Patecatl, the god of the herbs that triggered fermentation. Their children were collectively called the Sensun Totoctin, the 400 rabbits. In Nahuatl, 400 was the number used to mean, essentially, infinity. Each one of these rabbits personified a particular grade or mood of drunkenness, from cheerful to belligerent to weepy to vindictive. The leader was named Ometochtli, 2 Rabbit, whose temple still stands above the town of Tepoztlan, in the Mexican state of Morelos. The Spanish Franciscan missionary Bernardino de Sahagún, who compiled the Florentine Codex in the 16th century, dedicated entire chapters to pulque rituals. He described the religious calendar in which pulque could be drunk, and the strict legal regime around it. Under Aztec law, public drunkenness was punishable by death for any commoner under the age of 52. After 52, the law assumed you had earned the right and could drink freely. Across the same pre-Columbian Americas, the Andean civilizations were producing chicha, a corn beer fermented by chewing the corn first and letting human saliva convert the starches. Across the Pacific, the Japanese were producing kuchikamizake, a rice drink made by the same chewing technique. 2 continents independently invented the same method using their own enzymes. The 10-million-year-old chemistry that gave our ape ancestors their ADH4 mutation ended up running, by various routes, the wage system of Sumer, the construction labor of the pyramids, the religious calendar of Egypt and the Aztecs, the symposium of Greece, the pharmacy of Baghdad, and a friar's distillery in 15th-century Scotland. Every civilization that has ever existed had a deity, a ration system, a tax, a song, or a law about alcohol. Most of them had all 5. The chemical accident on the forest floor still owns the bar.